Good afternoon and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. I'm Hugh McKay. I'm president of the board of directors of the City Club. After the tragic events of 9/11, many people around the world began to suspect the average Muslim Arab of endorsing such attacks on the United States. Today's speaker, Amaney Jamal, says, quote, exacerbating this misperception has been the absence of Arab democratic institutions to vouch for the democratic and civil nature of Arab polities. Professor Jamal has been a leader in dispelling misperceptions and furthering understanding of how the world of Islam and politics figures into the ordinary lives of Arab Muslim citizens. Professor Jamal is one of the foremost experts on Islam and democracy in the Arab world. Her work, which has been widely cited in recent years, has examined the, quote, conundrum of democratization, unquote, in the Arab world, where popular support for democracy is very high, but until recently, democratic movements were scarce. Professor Jamal has directed a number of major studies focusing on understanding the Arab and Muslim American experience. A cum laude graduate of UCLA, Professor Jamal is Associate Professor of Politics at Princeton University, where she directs the workshop on Arab political development. She's the author of several influential books on democratization and the politics of civic engagement in the Arab world. Professor Jamal is a principal investigator in the, quote, Arab Barometer Project, unquote, winner in 2010 of the best data set in the field of comparative politics, the Leipart-Jaworski Verba Dataset Award. She is co-principal investigator of the Detroit Arab American Study and senior advisor on the Pew Research Center projects focusing on Islam in America and global Islam. In 2005, she was named a Carnegie Scholar. Since joining the Princeton community, Professor Jamal has continued her major research studies, and she's been a prolific contributor to the Journal of Democracy, Comparative Political Studies, Journal of Politics, and other scholarly publications. And she's been widely quoted, interviewed, and featured in myriad leading publications and news programs. She also serves as an advisor to the Council on Foreign Relations. The director of Carnegie Corporation's Scholars Program says, quote, Dr. Jamal is a first-class analytical scholar with a deep grasp of theory, history, and politics, as well as on-the-ground knowledge, unquote. Please welcome to the City Club Professor Amaney Jamal.
Thank you very much for that very generous and kind introduction. It's a great honor to be here at the City Club. I'd like to thank the City Club for hosting this afternoon's talk. I'd also like to thank my colleagues Pete Moore and Josh Stacher for inviting me out here. It's been a really great visit to Cleveland. So today I'd like to talk about the lack of democracy in the Arab world, and more or less I'll be discussing findings from my forthcoming book on the lack of democratization in the region. I start out the book basically asking a basic question that many of us who study the politics of the Middle East continue to ask ourselves, which is, as the rest of the globe, especially after the downfall of the Soviet Union, as the rest of the globe more or less moved towards more democracy, this was not necessarily the case in the Arab world. With the downfall of the Soviet Union, it was assumed that liberal democracy had emerged victorious. This so-called end of history would usher in a new wave of global democratization. However, an examination of the political development trajectory of the world's regions reveals that most countries have been, indeed, on a course of democratization. Freedom House, one of the major entities that registers and records and monitors democratic development, reports that over the past 15 years, the number of electoral democracies has increased from 69 out of 167 total states, that's 41%, to 119 out of 192 states, that's 62%. Yet although the world in general has thus witnessed more transitions to democracy, countries in the Arab world have been absent from this general momentum. And still more compelling yet, we've seen a lot of improvements in the Arab world, especially in terms of human development, education, some economic development, all pertinent indicators of modernization. But yet these improvements did not translate into democratic deepening in the region. Furthermore, it is often assumed that there's a dearth or there's a lack of appreciation of basic democratic values, a lack of appreciation or support for democratic principles, yet that's not necessarily the case. For the last 15 years, several of us have been monitoring public opinion from across the region, and we ask citizens a variety of questions about whether or not they support democracy, whether or not they prefer democracy, whether or not they appreciate democracy. And over what we see is that not only majorities, but vast majorities across different states in the region come back and say that they value, they welcome, they yearn for more democracy in their countries. Now, juxtaposed to these findings, we also are confronted with another reality, which is that across several Arab states, you see that alongside this enthusiastic support for democracy, there remains strong support for the status quo, the existing authoritarian structures. So, yes, you could applaud democracy, yes, you could support democracy, but there's some kind of hesitancy, if you may, among the populations to push for more democracy. And they more or less converge towards favoring the status quo or the authoritarian stalemate. This was especially true before the Arab Spring. Now, the Arab Spring, complicates this picture a little bit more, but witness what we're seeing in Syria, still witness some of the debates ongoing in Egypt. We're seeing a lot of domestic debates happening on the ground on whether democracy is the most useful, the most beneficial system of government. So what this project hopes to accomplish is to basically move beyond the argument that democracy is simply a matter of having this cultural orientation towards a democratic system, or basically it's a matter of education. If we could only teach people how to be democratic, they certainly would become more democratic. To say we're in that post-education moment where people actually do understand what democracy is, but they're asking themselves real questions about how useful democracy will be for their political systems moving forward. Now, what is Amaney talking about? I will get there. I promise. But first, let me basically go back for a moment and talk about the way we in political science and the way the policy community more or less has addressed this democratic deficit in the Arab world. More or less, there are two overarching explanations that have continued to dominate scholarly and policy inquiries about the democratic deficit. And it's important to appreciate these two overarching sets of explanations because more or less, if these are the two dominant approaches that are there to explain the lack of democracy, certainly the prescriptions that we come up with are also based on these two dominant perspectives. So the first dominant perspective is that of political culture. There just might be something about the political culture of the Arab world that does not conform to or bode well for democracy. There must be something about that value system. There must be something about the way the children are raised. There must be something about the values they hold dear that might undermine democracy. And these political culture models are pervasive in the field of political development. So it's not only about the Arab world. In fact, there were always political cultural explanations that explained the lack of China's development, actually before China's economic miracle happened. There were political cultural explanations explaining the lack of African development. There were political cultural explanations explaining the lack of Latin American development. But more or less, the one region that really has kind of inherited the bulk of the political culture explanations is the Arab world. The Arab world also has an additional component that other regions don't have, it has also the culture of Islam argument, right? Not only, perhaps, does the region not have the necessary values and orientations for democracy, but it probably is inflicted by this overarching system, political system of Islam that prevents it to be more democratic. So more or less there's been a variety, especially if you go to any of the major bookstores in the United States, Barnes & Noble's, Borders before it shut down and whatnot, you'll see that when you go into the Middle East section, a good chunk of those books fall under the rubric of the political culture arguments explaining the lack of democracy in the region. The truth of the matter is that if we look at the Muslim world, outside the Arab world, there are a lot of democracies in the Muslim world. Indonesia, Turkey, we can go on and on. These countries have democratized as they have remained Muslim countries. So we have to move beyond the explanation that it's Islam or that it's Islam that is preventing Arab democratization, but nevertheless we do have to confront the question about, well, there must be something then about the Arab world, because it's in the Arab world where we've seen the least democracy. Then what is it about the Arab world? And we don't necessarily want to privilege political culture explanations, because if we're now saying, well, it's not Islam because we do have democracy in the Muslim world, we certainly don't want to get in a place where we're saying, well, what is it about Arab? So let's just leave those set of arguments on one side. On the other side, there's the political economy explanations. And more or less, the arguments go that the Arab world lacks democracy because we have not witnessed the necessary economic development trajectories that are useful for democratic consolidation and growth. And more or less, the arguments advance to explain how economic structures can shape citizen support for democracy. Look at the role of development. And the Arab world has basically had a very slow development trajectory. And the development trajectory in the way that it's happened and proceeded in the Arab world is that it has not necessarily benefited middle class or would-be middle class sectors. Most political development accounts will tell you that the middle class was important for democratization, whether we're looking at Western Europe, whether we're looking at debates about taxation and representation in the United States, whether we're looking at the development of economic structures in other countries of the world. Having an autonomous middle class, a middle class that is not linked or controlled to by the regime, is very important for future democratic development. Now, in the Arab world, the other thing that confronts citizens is that in a lot of these countries, especially the oil states, these are rentier economies that afford their citizens very luxurious lifestyles to the point where you really don't have to do much, right? You don't have to pay taxes to get represented. You just have to be a compliant citizen and you'll be rewarded tremendously. I mean, the average woman in Kuwait works for about 15 years in the public sector and then can retire, and the retirement packages are just amazing. So the incentives to contest existing authority are not necessarily there. However, when we look at a lot of the empirical realities across the Arab world, what we see is that we're seeing more democratic contestation in countries that are rentier states, are oil states. For example, Kuwait is a classic example today where we're seeing a lot of democratic agitation, even while the monarchy is distributing resources and favors to its citizens. So that kind of undermines this understanding that, well, citizens are willing to trade their rights just for economic benefits. In a place like Jordan, where it's struggling economically, we would expect to see more democratic contestation, but it's there we're seeing people say that, maybe democracy is not the best system for this country. We certainly saw it in this last round of Arab Spring protests, where a lot of the protesters were frustrated. They were frustrated that other segments of the Jordanian population did not join in the protest. And I just want to break another misassumption about what was happening in Jordan. A lot of people believed that it was the Palestinians, the Palestinian Jordanians out in the streets protesting. In fact, we saw a lot of Jordanians protesting, and it was the Palestinian middle class of Amman that was kind of like, do we really want to rock the boat right now? Things are going pretty well for some of these urban sectors in the country. So they were the ones who kind of mobilizing behind the monarchy. And I'm talking about the Palestinian middle class sectors, not the lower classes. So we're seeing all these empirical realities that don't necessarily conform to our existing understandings, whether or not they're couched in political economic explanations or political cultural explanations or the Islam explanations. So the question is why? Why are we seeing this type of variation? Why aren't we seeing more democratic contestations in states that, for all accounts, for all indicators, would lead us to believe that we should see more democratic contestation? And why are we seeing contestation in countries like Kuwait that more or less are classic rentier states that are really providing their citizens with glorious amounts of rents and services? So more or less in this book manuscript, what I argue is that there's something faulty in the way we think about democracy. When we sit or we try to analyze and study why some countries are democratic and not democratic, we often look to each country and more or less contain each country within this artificial compartment and say whatever happens within each state, how it economically develops, how it politically, culturally becomes more mature. Basically, each state is this shielded entity that more or less explains its own evolution. But let's just forget about this idea about this, each state being a compartmentalized entity on its own. And let's just argue that these states exist in a larger international context, where states are also linked to other actors in the international arena, where states look at what's happening in the international context to shape the international context in ways that will shape domestic debates about the utility of democracy. Now, what am I talking about? I basically am arguing in this book is that one of the major basic components missing from our study of democracy and democratic development is that we've been, especially in comparative development, we have been for a very long time much more concerned at what's happening within these societies. But there's a host of issues happening in the international arena that also shapes the trajectory of what happens within these societies. And for the Arab region today is embedded in the international context in a way that no other region in the world is embedded. Today, the Arab world, 2012, is more economically dependent on the United States and more security dependent on the United States more than any other region in the world. Now, what does that mean? So let me borrow some of the language then from my colleagues who work in international relations. I work on comparative development, so for me to start to move almost to another subfield within my field was something that I wasn't very comfortable with, and I'm still trying to appreciate the paradigms used in international relations. So one of the most prominent scholars working on this issue of the international context and how it might shape domestic debates within countries is David Lake from the University of California, San Diego. And he talks about international hierarchy. And what does international hierarchy mean? More or less, the argument goes that hierarchy between one state and another exists when one actor, the dominant state, possesses authority over another actor, the subordinate state. Authority is never total, of course, but it varies in extent. And subordination in the international system can be a result of direct intervention or invitation, right? So we have to keep it nuanced, right? It's not that, the United States is out there just to conquer the Arab world. There are a lot of states in the Arab world that want and seek U.S. protection, security assistance, and military aid, and economic aid. Who recently asked the United States to guarantee a continuation of U.S. security aid to their country? The Muslim Brotherhood of Egypt has made that plea. Okay. We will get to that in Q&A, I know. But for now, I'm going to go on. Several countries benefit both economically and their security regimes depend on U.S. assistance. U.S. dominance of the Arab world is substantiated by a number of indicators. First, examining overall levels of U.S. official development assistance, this is U.S. aid, to all regions in the world from 1991, one notes that the Arab world is the largest recipient of aid from the U.S., even when we correct for Iraq. The Arab world is receiving, despite all its oil wealth, is receiving more aid from the United States than Africa. Between the periods of 1991 to 2006, the Arab world received $52 billion of aid. When excluding Iraq, the Arab world received $30 billion, while Africa received $25 billion. Second, looking at the correlates of war data, one sees that during the period between 1990 to 2001, and the correlates of war data only goes up to 2001. So we're missing like the war on terror, we're missing the war on Iraq, we're missing a lot of wars here. But even just looking at data up to 2001, we've had more U.S. military intervention in the Arab world than any other region of the world. So that's also another dimension of involvement. Further, to gain more leverage on the extent to which the Arab world is a client of the U.S., I borrow my colleague David Lake's security and economic hierarchy measures. I won't bore you with the details. More or less, there are a variety of indicators that look at the percentage of military deployments per capita, that look at the extent to which one's currency is pegged against the U.S. dollar, the extent to which one has trading partners outside of, in addition to the United States, a variety of dimensions that tap into security and economic dependence. And what we find is that the Arab world has increased its security and economic dependence on the U.S. since the fall of the Soviet Union like no other region in the world. In fact, it is the only region in the world that is both economically dependent on the U.S. and its security is dependent on the U.S. Now, David Lake tells us that when a region becomes both economically dependent and both its security is dependent, more or less you have an informal empire relationship between the external patron and the subordinate state. Now, what does this all mean? It means that the Arab world is dependent on the United States. What does this mean for democracy? It means that it's not lost on ordinary citizens how important it is to maintain strong ties to the United States for the future longevity, for the future prosperity, for the future economic development of their regions. If I'm sitting in Jordan and I'm a middle-class urban, living in the urban centers of Amman today, and I'm doing better during the last 5 years because there's open borders, there's trade, there's some economic assistance coming in, there's foreign direct investment coming in. If I want access to these global markets, I'm going to be careful to ensure that nothing jeopardizes this open access to global markets, to global trade. And so what might jeopardize global access to these markets or access to these global markets? If we push for more democracy and open up the political system, and the political system brings in elements that might be less hospitable to maintaining close ties to the United States, or in the case of Jordan, it would also entail Israel, because the peace treaty of 1994 was a huge incentive, served as a huge incentive to really reward Jordan economically and bring Jordan into the global economic markets, where a lot of people now are gradually reaping more and more of the benefits of that. You want to ensure that you don't bring in segments into the political process that will jeopardize these security agreements that your country has. Doing so can really affect your personal standing and the standing of the nation to some extent. So what I basically argue in the book manuscript is that in several of these countries where you have opposition movements that are anti-American, and most of these opposition movements tend to be Islamist. Now, I want to be careful to say that it's not because they're Islamist they're anti-American, because I will give you another example of an Islamist movement that is pro-American, right? And I also want to remind the audience that 20 years ago, it wasn't the Islamists weren't the major anti-American forces in the region. 20 years ago, it was the socialists and the communists and the leftist parties that were the major anti-American forces in the region. However, today, where we have Islamist forces that are anti-American and where they are influential, the Democrats in those countries are going to hesitate before they push for more democracy, or at least agitate for more democracy, or at least demand for more democracy. Why? Because they need to believe, they need to be reassured that more democracy is not going to mean sanctions or political punishments against their countries in ways that will retard the development of those countries. So in this project, I set out and I collected a variety of sources of data to more or less test the empirical arguments I was advancing. And what I did was I conducted with the Arab Barometer Project representative surveys across several Arab countries. The three that are featured in the book are Jordan, Kuwait, and Morocco. But I also conducted open-ended interviews with citizens in the three countries, 250 open-ended interviews. Each of the interviews lasted for more than an hour, where I basically talked to people. I asked them how they felt about democracy, what democracy meant to them. Did they believe that democracy and Islam were incompatible systems of government? And so I have this very rich data source that I've tried to bring into the book as well. And more or less, what the book will show, or what the arguments of the book demonstrate, is that in societies where there is anti-Americanism, and there are forces that are mobilizing on anti-American platforms, it's those societies that will stalemate, if you may, will be less hesitant to push for more democracy. Jordan is the classic example of the book. I also talked about the 2006 Hamas election in Palestine, and how basically at the eve of that election, 76% of Palestinians said they supported democracy. After that election, which brought in Hamas into power, support for democracy among Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza fell to 40%. Democracy became a liability because of the potential sanctions that Hamas would probably bring onto the Palestinian people. And I would like to talk more about that in Q&A. I did say that there was a country that had a pro-American Islamic movement, and that is the ICM, the Islamic Constitutional Movement of Kuwait. Remember, during the Gulf War, after Saddam invades Kuwait, the ICM, which was always a splinter group of the Muslim Brotherhood, could no longer remain loyal to the Muslim Brotherhood because the Muslim Brotherhood sided with Saddam during that war. So for the ICM to side with Saddam, you're basically saying we support our own occupation. It would have lost all its constituents. So the ICM basically broke with the Muslim Brotherhood, became much more of a pro-American force. In that country, even given the fact that it's a rentier state, given the fact that the state is distributing, if you've been to Kuwait lately, you'll see that that's a country where people enjoy a magnificent standard of living. But there is a lot of democratic agitation, a lot of push for more democracy, a lot of a willingness to try to hold some of the monarchy and the ruling families accountable. And I argue that's because there isn't this overarching worry about democracy bringing harm on the nation. There's no entity that's going to come to power, ICM or otherwise, that's going to ask the Americans to leave Kuwait. So in conclusion, what I argue is that we can't understand the lack of democracy in the Arab world without understanding and appreciating the international dynamics which structure some of these democratic debates within each of the countries. We do need to ask ourselves questions that are there mechanisms, if you may, are there policy leverages, if you may, that can allow us to address the sources of anti-Americanism? Can we reduce sources of anti-Americanism? Can we make it more difficult for movements to mobilize on anti-American platforms? What type of policies might make it more difficult to be anti-American? Some will argue for punitive measures. Some will argue for changing policies in the region. I'll leave on that note, and I look forward to taking your questions in the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we're listening to a forum featuring Amaney Jamal, Associate Professor of Politics at Princeton University. We will return to Professor Jamal in a minute for our traditional City Club question and answer period. Please go ahead and formulate your questions now, and please remember to keep them brief. We remind you all that you're all welcome to attend City Club forums, and we hope everybody listening will join the City Club. We need your support, so if you are not already a member, please do join the City Club. We welcome all of you here and those listening to WCPN 90.3 FM, WCLV, WTAM, or one of the many radio stations across the country. Our television broadcast partner is WVIZ PBS IdeaStream. Television broadcasts of the City Club are made possible by Cleveland State University and PNC. Our live webcast is supported by the University of Akron. We would like to welcome guests today at tables hosted by Baker Hostetler, Kent State University, and the Northeast Ohio Coalition on Middle East Studies. Thank you all for your support. We're also pleased to welcome students who are here as part of the City Club student program. Participation of these students is made possible by a generous grant from the Charles E. Spar Charitable Trust. With us today are students from Hawkins School, Shaw High, and Tri-C's Upward Bound. Will the students please stand and be recognized? Today is the Paul and Sonia Unger International Forum on Cleveland in the World, made possible by a generous gift from Paul and Sonia Unger. Joining us at the head table today are Sonia Unger and her son Alan. Will you please stand and be recognized? We also thank the Northeast Ohio Coalition for Middle East Studies and the Civic Commons and Dan Malthrop for their partnership with us today. Now we'd like to return to our speaker for our traditional City Club question and answer period. We welcome questions from all of you. Holding the microphones today, we have City Club Program Director Carrie Miller and 100th Anniversary Assistant Director Betsy Wallace. First question, please.
Professor, my question is that listening to you, is my assumption correct? Then, that if there's an attack on Iran from Israel or the U.S., there would be muted response from the population of the Arab countries?
There would be muted response?
To the attack in the population of the Arab world?
No, that's not my... I don't think I was trying to... I mean, that was not the point that I was trying to make. I think if there is an attack on Iran, you're going to see a lot of frustration in the Arab world. Actually, it's going to be one of those things, and I think it's one of the things that is also something that the administration is concerned about. It's going to inflame anti-American sentiment, especially if the attacks are on, the extent to which the attacks are going to claim civilian casualties and whatnot. It will inflame Arab sentiment, and to the extent that I'm arguing that the higher the anti-Americanism in some of these countries, and that levels of anti-Americanism are stifling the democratic agenda, it will hurt the democratic project in the Arab world. Right? That's the conclusion I would take from that.
In your prepared remarks, you made the statement that there's a lot of support going to the Arab world, and you said in spite of the oil wealth. Isn't it actually true that it's going there because of the oil wealth, and it's our supporting of the governments that maybe we don't completely agree with, but it contributes to that stability? And then the other question is, I'd like you to answer some of the questions you posed at the end of your speech. That is, what are the policy changes we can make in the U.S. to help create more or diminish the anti-Americanism?
Thank you so much. So the official development assistance aid is in addition to the military aid. So the military aid is mostly going to the Gulf countries that have oil, and that's going in the form of basically security agreements, troop deployments, and whatnot to protect those oil reserves. I mean, in a sense, that's viewed in our strategic interest to protect the oil reserves of the region and to maintain favorable ties with regimes that we might not necessarily agree with, but more or less are cooperative. So that's the first dimension. The other dimension of the aid packages, basically the aid packages have increased to countries like Jordan, like Egypt under Mubarak for compliance, or at least with coordinating with the United States. You know, Jordan has, its official development assistance has increased dramatically with its cooperation on the war in Iraq and on the war on terror. So more or less when Arab countries, or at least these regimes, do cooperate on some of our geostrategic priorities in the region, they do receive handsome aid packages in return. I think Hosni Mubarak's regime received over $20 billion, a $20 billion write-off on loans when it joined U.S. forces during the first Gulf War. So again, cooperation does elicit more aid in the form of official development assistance for these countries. And again, these are countries that are not necessarily democratic, so a lot of the resources are used to reinforce the regime's ability to stay in power. Now, on the policy issues, I mean, that's of course much more complicated. And in the book manuscript, I do spend some time trying to discuss the policy options on the table. You know, the U.S. does have geostrategic priorities. Something that I said yesterday is this issue of oil is one that I personally tried to avoid as a student of Middle East politics for a very long time until I started working on this book. And once you start really understanding how central oil is to our geostrategic interests and to the world economy, you can become easily depressed, because as long as oil remains the lubricant that runs the modern day economy, I'm afraid to say that it's hard to think about where change will come from in terms of thinking about refashioning our geostrategic priorities, at least on the issue of oil. In the book, I talk about 4 different sets of geostrategic priorities, though, in the region. One is oil. The other one is containing Iran and containing Iran's nuclear threat. The third is containing Islamism and Islamic movements. And the fourth is basically securing Israel's, the way Israel defines its geostrategic interest in the region. And so these 4 different sets of issues continue to dominate the way the U.S. interacts in the region. So on the issue of oil, we really can't do much. On the issue of containing Iran, I think we addressed with the gentleman's question, is that if we can probably contain Iran with sanctions, with trying to actually delay their acquiring nuclear weapons, that's seen as a more preferable option than an attack. Because the way I understand it is that most attacks, or hypothetical attacks, or attacks being simulated today, are really putting a lot of civilian casualties on the table as well. Once you have casualties, you're going to have a lot of mobilization, anti-American mobilization in the region. This won't be good for our policies in Afghanistan. It's certainly not going to be good for our policies in Iraq. It's going to destabilize the Gulf region in tremendous ways, and it will bring us back to the oil question. Then there's the Arab-Israeli conflict, and that's a conflict that we all know what it's going to look like in terms of a 2-state solution. We just have to get there. And everybody agrees that the partners are not going to get there if there's not a third party really to sit at the table and hammer out a lasting deal between the Palestinians and the Israelis. When we survey public opinion, when we talk to Arab citizens and when we survey public opinion from the Arab region on the Arab-Israeli conflict, the Palestinian issue is a sore point for not only the Palestinians but for Arab citizens across several states. When you survey Egyptians today, and if you look at their demonstrations in Tahrir Square, they were, yes, talking about the fall of Mubarak, they were talking about freedom and democracy, but they're also talking about liberation for the Palestinians. So it's become difficult to continue to say that there's this one Palestinian issue that is over there in the West Bank in Gaza, and it doesn't shape or motivate or influence the perceptions of Arab citizens in several countries. Then there's the issue of containing the Islamists. And basically that's the tricky part of the book, is basically saying the way we've handled all these 3 other issues, we've preferred authoritarian regimes over democratic regimes, we've supported these regimes even while they've repressed their citizens, we've given them aid, we've given them military, we'll come down harder on Iran, but not other allies. We really haven't pushed the Arab-Israeli issue forward. These issues play brilliantly into Islamist popularity and mobilization. So it's and then even to go after the Islamists increases their popularity among segments of the population. I don't believe, and I'm just going to take a little bit more time on this question than I probably should, because I know other people want to ask questions. But there's a constituency out there that would argue that the way to deal with Islamists is to confront the Islamists, to take them on violently. I believe that that only inflames sensibilities and it wins them more supporters. But what I do argue in the book is that we need to think of this as an audience effect project. If you want to think about how Islamism grew, it basically knew how to mobilize an audience that shared some of their platforms or their ideologies. Not the Islamic Sharia, we're going to establish an Islamic State ideology. When we survey people, the vast majority of people who support Islamic movements don't support an Islamic government as such. The vast majority of people who support Islamic movements are opposed to corruption, want more democracy, want better standards of living, and they are upset with a U.S. foreign policy in the region that they've seen that has privileged only certain segments of that region at the expense of their own interests. So you've privileged the monarchies, you've privileged Israel, you've privileged oil, you've privileged your geostrategic interests, all the while the citizens of the Arab world are the ones who are suffering economically and politically because of the lack of democracy. So that's the audience that the Islamists were able to target. So we need to think the same way and think about, okay, can we take a message to that audience and say, better economic opportunities, better democratic opportunities. We're going to try to have a more balanced approach to resolving conflicts in the region and winning that audience away from the Islamists. If the Islamists don't have an audience to win over, then they don't have an audience to win over, right? That's how you deal with the issue. Thank you.
You've almost answered my question, because my question was about this term Islamist, because I think that there's a lot of misunderstanding about it, and I'm concerned when I hear scholars and academics using it because they mean a particular thing and a particular political ideology, but the general public sees that Islamist as meaning all Muslims and what Muslims think. So I think that's a very dangerous and very loaded term, and I would love to see academics find a more appropriate term. And what do you suggest? Because it's such a complex concept. So thank you.
Right. No, that's right on target. And that's why I tried to, at least in the talk, say that, I don't want to say that all Islamists are anti-American, that, there is anti-American sentiment among other segments of the population. I totally agree that this word Islamist is problematic, especially if you look at, some of the propaganda being circulated in the United States about all Muslims being Islamist and whatnot. I think Islamists, the way I try to think about it is that you have Islamist ideologues and then Islamist supporters. Islamist ideologues are the vast minority of the Islamist supporters. They have a very political, theological agenda that they'd like to see. The Islamist supporters are basically more or less everybody who's dissatisfied with the status quo, that can't find a better mobilized or organized movement to support, so they support the Islamist movements. Now, they can be closer ideologically to the ideologues, but they could also be far away. I mean, I always tell my students this one story that was told to me while I was doing these interviews, is that there were two men sitting in a bar drinking beer. And they were saying socialism is bad, and Mubarak is bad, and Abbas is bad. Like, everybody's bad. Islam is the solution, And they cheer, So it gives you a sense of, sometimes the level of desperation, the lack of political plurality, the lack of available political movements, right? It renders Islamism as a very attractive political ideology to support, especially because especially when we look at what's often cited as the number one reason that citizens support Islamic movements in the region is because those movements are perceived to be anti-corruption. That's what people are basically have had it with the levels of these regimes flaunting their corruption in the public sphere.
With respect to democracy, I would like to inquire about the civil rights of women in the region. It appears that the issue has different circumstances in each country.
Right.
But overall, where do you see those civil rights today post-Arab Spring? Where do you see them moving, and have there been some effective strategies?
So those are very important set of issues. So the truth of the matter is, where we've seen Islamist victories in Parliament, we've seen less movement on women's rights reforms. So on the one hand, now here's the issue, right? On the one hand, the Islamists are gaining a lot of popularity because they're talking about anti-corruption, they're talking about pro-democracy. If you look at who's voting for Islamist movements, by and large, it's women who are voting for these movements, but the movements continue not to advance what we would consider adequate reform packages on the issue of gender. It's the one thing that's not satisfactory right now. Now, the Arab Spring is still in motion. If you look at Tunisia, there's a lot of agitation among women's rights groups that more has to be done. But it's one of those issues that's going to require, I think, more work. Now, again, we can basically argue that, you know, maybe after democracy, the next set of issues that will be tackled will be the women's issues. Some people are very worried about, you know, doing that democracy and political and civil freedom should be a package that should be shared by women moving forward. So I don't want to paint a rosy picture about that. Where we have seen debates, where we're witnessing change, it's not necessarily in favor of women right now.
Yeah. One thing that influences a lot of attitudes in the West is manifest, I think, in an awful lot of talk of late about the persecution of Christians in the Muslim world. I'm thinking of the latest cover story in Newsweek. And I think that's obviously something we Christians need to be smart about, lest we play into the hands of some very unfortunate attitudes. But I was wondering if, given all the attention to that is growing these days, if you had any comment.
So I grew up in the West Bank from the age of 10 to 18. And I grew up in a Muslim family. I went to a Christian school. And when I came back to continue my college education in the United States, everybody kept on saying, well, what about the Muslim-Christian divide in Palestine? It's like, wait, I went to school with Christians. Like, you know, we didn't have a Muslim-Christian divide in Ramallah. I mean, and I never understood it. And I do understand that there's a history of Muslim-Christian hostility in the Middle East in the early 1900s, right? And I don't want to say that there isn't. I don't want to say that Christians are not a minority in these countries. But in most states, Christians are afforded rights and basically are doing, if you look at socioeconomic patterns, most Christian minorities are doing better than Muslims in a lot of these countries. However, saying that, and if you look at the major cleavages, so I don't want to say that everything was rosy. But what I do want to say, if you look at the major cleavages, at least among the Palestinian community at the time, right? It was between the secular Muslims and the religious Muslims. Or it was between the villagers and the people who lived in the urban centers. Those were the major cleavages that people talked about all the time. And in the urban centers, you had basically the Muslims and the Christians on the same page in terms of the issues they supported. So I don't want to say that it's not an issue, but what I do want to say is that there's a remarkable discourse here in the United States that continues to say that there's this ongoing Christian-Muslim divide in the Arab world, one that those of us who have lived in the Arab world don't see. And I don't say this because I'm Muslim. I have a lot of Christian friends. If they were here, they would say the same thing. However, having said that now, the events in Egypt, especially with the Coptic minority, are of concern. Right? These were contained during the Mubarak regime to a large extent. And so the question is, are there certain segments of the population, when I talk to my colleagues and friends in Egypt, what they're telling me, and I don't know if this is true, what they're telling me is that a lot of this, I mean, if you work on the politics of the Middle East, you'll know that a lot of what you hear is based on conspiracy theories all the time. And so to the extent that you can prove this is quite difficult. But what they tell me is that the military has become invested in agitating some of this Muslim-Christian divide to basically ensure for it a role to stay in power. Because if the military goes, this is what the future of your society is going to look like. So I don't know if that's true, but the fact that you can have these long periods of calm, followed by subsequent periods of turmoil, leads me to believe that something else is happening that's above and beyond just Muslim-Christian hate. The Muslim Brotherhood has issued a statement more or less that it's willing to bring Coptics into the movement, which is also seen as momentous for the movement itself. So I'm hopeful that these are not going, this is not, you know, the beginning of something that's going to be worse, but rather it's just a fluke in what's happening. I hope.
Professor Jamal, even though in Egypt some of them may have been elected democratically, aren't some of the ideas and policies of the Muslim Brotherhood worthy of condemnation?
There are absolutely a lot of opinions of the Muslim Brotherhood and quite honestly of all political movements, whether in the Arab world or sometimes even the United States, that are worthy of condemnation. But what do? If we want to privilege democracy, and we want to privilege free speech, and we want to privilege the idea that we have some faith in this notion of public deliberation and of the public sphere being able to regulate free speech, you can't basically say that we're going to censor out what we don't like to hear. And I had this conversation with several people in the region, especially in Kuwait. So let me get back to Kuwait. Kuwait, there's a lot of support for democracy, but you have this the Islamic constitutional movement is a very socially conservative movement. What does it do when it comes to power, when it accesses parliament in the mid-90s? It segregates Kuwait University. Kuwait University is still segregated. Courses have to be taught 2 times to men and then to women, because they're not in the same classroom. And I kept saying to my, in Kuwait you have a very strong liberal tide. I think one of the strongest liberal tides outside of Lebanon, I would say, is in Kuwait today. And I kept asking my liberal colleagues, like, what are you going to do about this? I mean, they're going to continue segregating Kuwait. They were preventing women from participating in elections. And they said, leave it alone. This is what democracy is about. We're going to have to experiment with these issues. We're going to have to let people to respond to this. We're going to have let people then stand up and say that, you know what? There is no Islamic rationale for locking women out of the political process, and that's exactly what happened. The people who shut down the ICM from mobilizing against women's participating in elections were the same women that voted for them. Ultimately, they stood up and said, you know what, you guys just want us to support you guys, but we can't participate out there. We no longer buy it. If women could vote at the time of the Prophet, I don't see why you guys are going to keep us out of the political process. So in many ways, people will say that's democracy. The revolution, the burning of the Bastille happens, in early 1800s. It's about 30 years after the burning of the Bastille and during the French Revolution that we then found we saw a consolidated democratic system that was acceptable. Women didn't gain the right to vote in this country until, we don't want to go there. But we were democratic for a very long time. What I'm trying to say is that we have to have at some level some faith in these publics to basically deal with some of these horrible policies, but then to learn from them and basically mobilize around them and say, no, just like we in this country learned from the errors of our democratic experience. The civil rights movement in '65 is a very recent episode in our history. And for the longest time, we had no problem reconciling our democratic principles alongside a system of subordination. I'm not saying that's great. I'm just saying at some point, if we're going to have faith in the people to lead themselves, they're going to have to do some self-discovery. And if we keep pushing people out of office or trying to manipulate and control how they should think and be, we're jeopardizing the democratic process and we're feeding into the fundamentals and the radicals and the ideologues that we worry about to begin with. Thank you.
Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we've been listening to a forum featuring Amaney Jamal, Associate Professor of Politics at Princeton University. Thank you, Professor Jamal. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This forum is now adjourned.
For information on upcoming speakers or for podcasts of the City Club, go to cityclub.org.